In this final presentation about situated cognition, we'll talk about some of the ways in which theorists have viewed applying situated cognition to classroom instruction. So, we've basically talked about the core assumptions behind Ausubel and schema theory and situated cognition are to make information meaningful by putting it in terms of meaningful context, whether that meaningful context is existing prior knowledge as assumed by Ausubel and schema theory, or that meaningful context is a realistic context as assumed by situated cognition. Now let's talk about how we can apply this theory to learning situations. The first idea brought up by situated cognition theorists is cognitive apprenticeships. In an apprenticeship, you learn about a culture by becoming an apprentice in that culture. And so when you became a student teacher, or sometimes even a graduate student in a lab, you do this by, you sort of become an apprentice in a field before you're a full member of that field. Apprenticeships typically involve very authentic tasks with the goal of applying knowledge obtained beyond the learning situation. So this might include, like I said, an internship or a student teaching. There are things that you can learn in school, but as you all know, when you actually get into the situation, there's so much more that you can't learn from a textbook, that you can only learn by being in that situation. And the goal of an apprenticeship is to give you that in terms of a learning context. Embedded in this is the idea that we're never really finished learning. You can't learn everything you need to know from a book, and you can't even learn it once you're in the context. Learning is a continual process. Some disadvantages of apprenticeships might be that to really sort of succeed at a minimal level in an apprenticeship, it might acquire at least some base level of skills. There's often a conflict in the rigor of the learning situation and the actual practice. And so this is where you have to be clear between the teacher or the facilitator of learning and the student in what are the expectations and what are the understandings of the student's level of learning as they're going through the apprenticeship. One common complaint, especially in student teaching context, is a lack of reflective opportunities. Often student teachers are just thrown into a teaching situation and it's sort of sink or swim without a whole lot of guidance and without a whole lot of opportunity to look back and reflect on what went right or what went wrong. The next way in which situated cognition can be applied to learning is through anchored instruction, and we talked about this under Ausubel, whereas this involves problem solving in really authentic contexts. And so the Driscoll text briefly described a Vanderbilt research group who developed videos with situation-based problem solving examples. In general, these videos are very highly rated. The Vanderbilt research group is a very well-known and well-respected group. But I want you to think about, under schema theory, what would be an especially important element in using these videos? It's not enough to develop videos with situation-based problem-solving examples if you don't get students to use their prior knowledge in some way, and often the context can force them to use their prior knowledge, but sometimes even that's not enough, and so you may have to signal students to use their prior knowledge. We often do this in teaching reading. We have to signal students when to use specific skills or when to use specific knowledge to understand a text. A final way in which we can apply situated cognition to learning is through learning community. These are situations where both teachers and students are involved in the learning process as collaborators and both make contributions. So instead of the teacher giving all the knowledge and the student receiving it, everybody is involved and learning becomes a much more collaborative opportunity. Everyone contributes and everyone is held accountable, And so learning is no longer on an individual level. I've done this with my students before, where we have a reading group, and it's something that I might know a little bit about, but there might be new articles in that reading group that I haven't read before or haven't really studied in depth. In these reading groups, I may present some articles for discussion, and I have students present articles for discussion. So we're all held accountable in that we all have to read and present information, but we're all also learning, and so it's not just me teaching and students learning anymore. So now that we've talked about how to apply situated cognition, let's talk about how to assess it, because it makes assessing learning a lot more complicated. In general, assessments should reflect the desired applications of the knowledge in question. It's not good enough anymore to just give factual questions, because the whole goal of this is to put knowledge in context. Normal or formal assessments can be used, but you might have to tailor them to specific contexts. And so in the text, several recommendations by McClellan and Collins included that assessments could involve a diagnosis of individual skills and weaknesses. It might involve summarizing group abilities throughout the learning process. It also might involve looking at other kinds of assessments than just formal assessments. For example, portfolios are really interactive in that they're selected by an individual, but they may reflect the applications of knowledge that a teacher specifically desires in a specific context. So we've talked about basic cognition, and now we're talking about applying it. One benefit of applying it, at least within the situated cognition approach, is that we're starting out with the familiar. Learning is contextualized within something familiar and within something that's safe to the learner. It's connecting new information to familiar information, like we would talk about under schema theory. And it sort of validates students' implicit knowledge about a topic. So students feel like they're coming into this situation with something to give, rather than just coming in as blank slates, that their job is to learn everything. Within situated cognition theory, there are multiple right approaches and solutions to problem solving. And so we're not just using rules to solve problems anymore, but because there's such an emphasis on realistic and collaborative learning, there are several right ways to do something. Finally, through involvement in the discovery process, students acquire tools in ways that are conducive to them and in realistic contexts. And they might actually acquire them in ways in which they'll actually use them, instead of learning rules that are abstract and then trying to apply those rules in a wide variety of contexts. They're learning the use of these tools in specific contexts. Okay, so this is the end of the situated cognition presentation. There's one more presentation that gives a brief example of how a specific topic might be taught according to a traditional approach versus a situated cognition approach.